Okay, that's everybody in the waiting room. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jen Jones. I'm the VP of Career Development, and thank you for joining us today. Today is our first commercial corner. So I'm excited to announce that I have Scott Smith with me. Scott is our commercial operations manager and has already been a really great resource for our leadership team. So as you guys start to, put your foot into commercial real estate, or if you've been doing a lot of commercial transactions, continue to go to your office leader, or if you're new to business level, your Accelerate coach when you have questions or you get stuck or you need some insight. And our leadership team has a direct line to connect with Scott. So he's there as a resource for all of our questions, and going to be doing our monthly commercial corner with us. And before I hand it over to Scott to, further introduce himself, just a couple Zoom items. You guys all entered in on mute. Feel free as we go through the content today to use the chat box if you want to submit a question so that you don't forget it. And then we are going to dive through questions in the chat box at the end. And, at the end, you're also welcome to unmute, ask your questions, so that you can have some back and forth dialogue with Scott as well. We are also recording it, so the playback will be available for you guys, and we will get that sent out. Scott?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. Hope you're all well. I see a bunch of faces that I recognize and some that I do not, so I apologize if I have not had the opportunity to meet everyone in person as of yet. Hopefully we can do that soon. I know we have a couple company meetings coming up, and hopefully get to see some face-to-face time with everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Jen. My name is D. Scott Smith. I always tell people when they ask me what the D stands for, I say it's because I'm half of a doctor. Yeah, you'll get that one in a second. But I started my commercial real estate career in 2007. I started in residential real estate and quickly realized that there's a skill set that residential realtors have that I do not have. I'm more math and numbers kind of brain processes. And I realized that if I was going to stay in real estate, that I should probably figure out something that I didn't have to like show properties on weekends or like write down people's kids' birthdays. I'd always just went to rates of return numbers, cost of construction. So I started dabbling in commercial real estate, and I say dabbling because I didn't do it full time. I still did residential investing, but I got at the time, I got a $6 million listing, and I wrote it on a residential listing agreement. And it provided me and my brokerage no security in the event that the earnest money deposit had to get forfeited. So long story short, started out as a $6 million deal, ended up an $18 million deal with $1 million earnest money deposit. I stood to make about $250,000 on that deal once it closed. I worked that deal for about 3 going on 4 years. Had a closing date set, and 30 days before closing, the bank decided they weren't going to fund the acquisition because the developer had a couple other residential towers that he was developing, and they didn't think that the developer could stomach carrying that much debt. And so they pulled the funding 30 days before settlement. And so my client, the seller, had $1 million mortgage on his property. And the earnest money deposit was $1 million, non-refundable. So he let the deal not close and kept the buyer's $1 million deposit, in which I didn't receive any of that as part of the commission because the documents that I wrote the listing agreement on didn't secure us in that fashion. He then asked me to relist the property, and I declined that opportunity because I wasn't going to work more years and not get paid. Through that, I decided, if somebody had been there to help me along the way, that I could have had some of my questions answered. Something as simple as, hey, is it okay to write a listing agreement on a residential listing agreement? That outcome might have been different. So I kind of started diving into how am I going to help other agents try to avoid some of the pitfalls that I went through. So I started writing and developing classes that are geared towards residential practitioners, but can also be easily digested by seasoned professionals. So that's kind of what we thought of when we were doing this class. How are we going to talk about commercial vocabularies? How are we going to talk about business etiquette? Hang on one second. My computer that you can't see is not operating right now. Sorry about that. And so we wanted to talk a bit about how are we going to go about helping our agents understand commercial real estate, right? And so knowing that we don't have a lot of agents that are practicing commercial full-time, and we don't have a lot of agents that are doing 100% commercial activity, we decided it would be a good opportunity to have these once a month kind of meetings as to what are agents expected to know in commercial real estate, and how can we help them like better understand how to do commercial from a company perspective. So that's kind of the basis of this. We created this so that all of our agents could be more successful, and to kind of help take some of the pressure off of the managers whenever their agents ask them a commercial real estate question and they may not feel comfortable answering that. We wanted to have a resource to where everyone can go. So first and foremost, if you're an agent on the call, you should always go to your manager first. I'm not here to replace the manager. That's probably going to be the first thing that I'm going to ask you if you have a commercial question is, hey, what did your manager say, right? So I don't want to be the person that gets in between you and your manager. I would like to work with you and your managers so that we can all formulate a game plan, a custom game plan for each scenario in commercial real estate, because that's really kind of the heart of commercial real estate, is that there really is no standard, right? Everything is kind of custom, all the way down to the documents, all the way down to the marketing, the finance, the tax structures. Everything that we're going to talk about today is customizable to each scenario, which is one of the things that I actually appreciate about commercial real estate, is that it's not so cookie cutter, right? So everything isn't the same all the time. Everything changes on a day-to-day basis. So you need to be prepared and to think ahead. What are those changes? What are some of the pitfalls that I can encounter here? And I would say that, I mean, at least some of you probably don't even know the questions to ask much less if the answers to the questions were right? So we wanted to try to kind of say, hey, how do we get you to that next step? So that's kind of like a long ways to answer that question. But so yeah, thanks for being here. That's why we're here, to help everybody build, grow, learn. That's what we do here at Home Sale. Probably the first thing I want to talk about, and I do talk a lot, so I apologize. If you do have questions, like Jen said, we're gonna just add them up at the end. We've left 10, 15 minutes at the end to help answer any questions that you may have. And if you don't have questions, then you're probably not paying attention. So I do expect some good questions from everybody. We need to talk first about like the vocabulary. So there's a lot of words that we use in commercial real estate that you probably don't encounter in your residential day-to-day arena. Some words are specific to commercial leases. Some words are specific to sales. So they're not always 100% interchangeable, even geographically, right? So the way that some of the math is calculated based off some of the words is going to change in, say, Annapolis, and it's going to be different in Reading, right? So even in our multi geographical area, we're going to have different definitions to some of those same words. But this, we're going to kind of go over generalization as to what some of these words mean. So just by show of hands, either electronically or like physically, has anybody done commercial leasing before? Okay, a couple of you. Okay, cool. Good deal. So leasing is a specialty. Investment sales is a specialty. And you would think that they kind of go hand in hand, but they may not. Leasing itself, you can build an entire career on just doing leasing activity, and you can do investment sales that the value is derived from the lease, although you may not necessarily be a leasing broker for commercial. So I would encourage everyone to eventually, not right now, but eventually kind of, feel your way through the commercial landscape and kind of figure out, what am I best suited for? What am I going to be able to make the most money in? What are my strong suits? What is my resources in my local community? Is there a lot of investment sales activity? Is there a lot of leasing activity? So the leasing itself, we're going to touch on a little bit next month when we do full on kind of leasing. How do you make money in leasing? Everything about commercial leasing. Today, we're just kind of going to go over vocabulary and things like that. So some leasing terms that you're going to want to know is pass-throughs, right? In commercial leases, they will pass through. That's why they get the word pass through, expenses onto the tenant. So you may see a property that's advertised for, let's say, $10 a square foot, meaning if you have 1,000 square foot, $10 a square foot, that's a annual figure. So you take that total and then divide it by 12 to get the monthly. That is not necessarily what you or your client are gonna pay in that price tag, because they're gonna be pass-throughs on to the tenant. Now that could mean taxes, it could mean insurance, it could mean maintenance, it could mean exterior snow removal. That's probably a big one right now in Pennsylvania. Trash removal. It could mean maid services. It's not just utilities. It could mean a bunch of different things. So when you see a advertised rate, just know that's probably not the real rate. There is additional expenses that you're going to have added on top of that quoted square foot. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Yep. Okay. Another clause in leases that you want to watch out for is that that same price doesn't necessarily mean that that is the same price next year. Every year you will have escalation clauses or bump ups, excuse me, which is a certain fixed percentage, if negotiated, that you would increase the rental rate by. So using that example, if you were renting a property for $10 a square foot and you had a 3% increase every year, that would be 3% of $10, which is what, $1.50. So it'd be like what, $11.50 the next year. So then the next year would be, because it compounds, it would be 3% of $11.50. So then you're at 12. So that end price tag is gonna be totally different than your starting price tag because of the bumps, the pass-throughs, the escalation clauses. Okay. Now, when you're looking at an investment sale, when you look at those lease totals, you are also going to have things that get deducted from that lease total to generate what we're gonna call the net operating income. You may have heard this term and seen it expressed as a NOI. So if you see NOI, it means net operating income, which in its most simplest form is if you take all of the incomes from that property and all the leases from that property and you minus out any expenditures that you don't pass through to the tenant, you are left with your net, right? That is going to be the figure that is going to derive the value of the asset, is your net operating income. Now, there's entire classes and days that we spend just on how to calculate effectively what your net operating income is in an investment. So that may be slightly sophisticated, but we just want you to get familiar with the vocabulary and say, hey, if I see NOI, like, what does NOI mean? It means net operating income. And I don't know of another word that is used across the country for that. So I think net operating income you could use in any other state and people are going to know exactly what you're talking about. Through that, you've probably heard the word cap rate, right? CAP rate. Well, unfortunately, we have not really done a good job in explaining what a cap rate is because most people believe that a cap rate is the return on the investment, but it's actually not the return on the investment. A cap rate measures how fast you get your initial down payment back, right? And the reason why a cap rate cannot be a return on an investment is because I'm just gonna pick on Rod because I see him in the classroom, but so me and Rod may be in different tax brackets, right? Rod may be able to go get a better mortgage than what I can get. So if we're looking at that same property to purchase, well, when Rod takes into account his things like what's my tax bracket, how much debt can I apply to this, his cap rate is going to be different than what mine would be. So because of that, the cap rate cannot be the return on the investment because it's specific to the investor, right? Does that make sense? So it's really, we call it crap because it really is just a marketing term, right? So a cap rate really just shows how fast you're going to get your investment back. A low cap rate would mean you're going to get it back at a much slower rate. It also means that there's less risk involved. Money tends to run from risk, right? So if you have a very low cap rate, it means it's going to take you much longer time to get that return on your investment back. If you have a much higher cap rate, it's going to assume that it's a more risky investment, right? But you're also going to have a much higher cap rate. So it may be a little counterintuitive, but just know if you want more money, you have to have a higher cap rate and higher risk. If you are more of a lower, longer secured, safe player, then you can accept a lower cap rate. Also, a lot of the big Wall Street investment firms can buy real estate on a much lower cap rate because their cost of capital is next to nothing versus me. I'm going to have to pay interest and points and et cetera, in order to acquire that same asset. So that's kind of what the cap rate is. And you'll probably see that advertised a lot. You'll probably see it advertised as like, in our market, it's like 6, 7, 8% cap rate. Just know, don't tell your client that that's their rate of return, because that's not accurate, right? It's how fast they get their money back, in truth. There are some more sophisticated ways to do that, which are much more math complicated and much more detailed than I'd like to do in a full-on classroom setting like this, but just some terms and some key understandings of what those are. There is a cash on cash return. I believe I saw somebody pop up in the chat there, cash on cash return, and that is actually more accurate, and it because it does take into effect the amount of mortgage that you have and that the property can sustain. And it takes to what we call whoop out, because you have to whoop the money out of your pocket. I'm not kidding, that's what they taught us in class. So you have to, it goes into how much money do you have out of your pocket in the investment as it relates to how much cash is returned on the investment after you pay the mortgage. It is, however, still incomplete because it does not take into account taxation. And as we know, unfortunately, everything gets taxed. So the cash on cash return, just know you'll see that advertised as COC. We like all these little abbreviations and stuff in commercial real estate, so make it confusing. But so COC is cash on cash return, and that is effectively how much money am I going to get back after I put my initial investment money in, right? So if you had $0 in an investment and you made $10,000, what would be your cash on cash return? Anybody? Kind of a trick question. You would have an infinite rate of return, because if you put $0 in and you got money back, you would have an infinite rate of return, right? So that's kind of how they just compare cash and cash returns versus cap rates. Now, the most effective and efficient way of doing the math on a commercial investment would be an internal rate of return. You'll see that advertised as an IRR. And that takes into account debt, taxes, everything on a dollar for dollar basis while it sits in the investment, okay? That is the most sophisticated analytical tool that we use in commercial real estate. Internal rate of return, and you will see that advertised as IRR, right? So I have to mention those things up front, and then it may be a little heavy right up front, so I do apologize, but I need to mention those things up front because the rest of the stuff kind of builds off those three definitions.
A couple questions that
Yeah.
stick with this topic before you kind of switch
Oh,
gears.
yeah, sure.
Is there a difference between rent and lease terms?
Yes, there is. Great question. There is a difference between rate and lease terms. The lease terms will also include all the terms that you're going to have to pay, whereas rent is just the actual monetary figure. Right? So rent will be included in the lease terms, but the lease terms will include when does the occupancy start? When does your payments start? A lot of times they're not the same, right? So if you're doing a good job as a commercial broker, you have to do a build out for an office, you don't want to start paying rent the day you sign the lease, right? Because then you're gonna be paying rent while the construction is going on. And as we know, construction delays happen, expenses, overrides happen. So, if you're paying several $1,000s a month in a lease and you can't occupy that space for 10, 12 months, you've just burned through 10, 15, 20 or more $1,000 because you didn't negotiate when your rent commencement is, which is different than when your lease commencement. So all those are lease terms that should include the rental rate, but they are not the same thing. Okay.
Okay. Natasha, just, let us know if you have further questions in the chat box, if you want to keep going with that. Another question, what is the difference between a CAM fee and net, double net, triple net? Are the net ones the ones that fluctuate and CAMs remain consistent for a predetermined period of time?
Yes, great question. That is very specific. I do appreciate that. That's a multi-part question, so let me answer the first one. CAM, C-A-M, stands for Common Area Maintenance, right? So you may pay maintenance on your location inside of a multi-unit building, whether that be an office or retail or industrial or whatever. Don't typically see these in multifamily. So just know most of the stuff that we're talking about today, we probably won't touch much on multifamily because you don't do CAMs and things like that as a residential tenant in a building. On the commercial side, it's not uncommon to pay for maintenance also in the common area. So the area that the other tenants also use, parking lots, hallways, lobbies, elevators, you name it. If it's multi-used from each tenant, then each tenant pays a portion towards that maintenance as well. That's what is known as common area maintenance. You should probably make sure that in your lease, you have the provision to audit the expenses of the landlord. Some of them will do that, some of them won't, depends on the sophistication of your landlord. Because there's a lot of times to where the landlords may inflate their common area maintenance figures to cover other shortfalls in that lease. And so just make sure you're not getting squeezed on that. That's kind of what common area maintenance is. As for the ends that you see on different leases, this is very important because we basically see a triple net lease, which is NNN, which means you are paying your base rent, you are paying your utilities, you are paying your insurance, you are paying your maintenance. Okay, so you are paying for everything on top of that base rate. So like I said earlier, you see a property advertised for $10 a square foot, but if it's a triple net lease, that means you may actually be paying, sometimes, depends on the property, as much in base rate as you would you may be paying just as much in your pass-throughs as you would your base rate. So you may actually end up paying $20 a square foot because of those triple net expenses. So one of the things I like to say when I'm doing my analytical work is not all $10 is the same $10, right? So if it's advertised as $10, that's all great, but what else is added on to that? And that's what those NNNs are. Those are the things that get added on top of that base rate. So in a triple net lease, taxes, insurance, maintenance, CAM, and anything else. In a modified gross lease or NN lease means you basically will pay your base rate plus utilities and maybe something else, right? It's modified. You're not paying only your base rate, but you are also not paying for everything. So in that case, maybe the owner is paying for their taxes, right? That's what the NN would stand for, or modified gross. And then in a gross lease, if you remember back to your real estate licensing days, a gross lease is you pay that one rate, and that's it. That's what you pay. We do have some leases like that still today where you pay one fee and that's it. Everything else gets taken out from the landlord's check. Okay. So that's kind of the difference between triple net, double net, and CAM fees. Make sense? All good?
Yep, last one that was kind of touched on, what percent of vacancy, if any, do you calculate in cap rate?
I'm sorry?
What percent of vacancy, if any, do you calculate in the cap rate?
What percentage of vacancy? The cap rate does take into account the vacancy because it is calculated on that net operating income. So any vacancy in that building is calculated in that cap rate. But just so you know, from the lender standpoint, a building is never 100% occupied if it's 100% occupied. Because they're going to want to include a safe rate, which is basically a rate in which they will calculate for late payment and credit losses.
Okay.
Okay.
Looks good. Keep rolling.
Good questions. So another thing that you need to be aware of when you're looking at all these rates and calculations and things is that also all the properties are not equal. So you'll see some properties that are AAA. You'll see some properties that are B, and you'll see some properties that are C. Now, each of those property classes and each asset group, so you have your main four groups, which are office, retail, industrial, and multifamily. Those are kind of like the four main food groups, if you will, of commercial real estate. But in each of those, you're going to have different classifications of assets as well. So a Class A retail location is going to be priced differently than a small standalone Class C retail that may be off the beaten path somewhere. You can't get the same rental rates for each of those property types, even though they're in the same market, simply because of the class of each asset. So just know going in that each property's got different classes as well, which is going to change some of the figures and things like that. So you would discover most of that in what we call a study period, which you probably do not have in your residential world, or duty of discovery. You may find in residential, but it is not uncommon in commercial to tie a property up, is what we say. While you are looking at things like how much is it going to cost to construct, what kind of financing can I achieve, what kind of tax structure can I put this asset in, any slew of things. Are there any environmental conditions? Is there enough electrical service coming to the asset? So any number of things is what we are looking for whenever we're doing a study period, which is very common in commercial sales. Not that common in commercial leases, although it can be. Every situation is different and independent, so it can be, but it's not as common. You're almost always going to see that in a commercial sale. So if you're doing a commercial sale and someone says to you, hey, I want to buy this property and I'm going to buy it with a mortgage and I want to close in 30 days. That doesn't happen in commercial. Like, we have study periods. The lender is going to want to make sure there's not any, contaminated soil. Traffic studies are going to need to get done. Any slew of things. Is there any history of contamination in the? Has there been? Was it used to be used as a gas station? Right. These are all things that if somebody submits a contract and they're going to close in 30 days, and it's not going to happen. So just be aware. That should be a red flag. Let me see. What are some other things? In a lease, you're going to probably see the term TI, which stands for tenant improvement. You're going to see that as a TI allowance. That's the amount of money that you're going to ask the landlord to contribute for your construction. Okay. So the landlord is going to contribute a certain percentage. If you ask, they're probably not going to just voluntarily give this figure, but a landlord is going to contribute a certain amount of dollars for your renovation cost. And that's what is known as a TI, which is a tenant improvement request from the tenant. So that's very common in the commercial world to kind of see, what is tenant improvement, what is the rate per square foot. That is kind of specific to each area. So, a TI allowance in Washington, D.C. is going to be a lot more than a TI allowance in Lancaster, simply because the rental rates are going to be much higher, right? So things to consider as well when you're looking for the best location to put your clients, even if it's, in a lease, you may be like, well, how much do you have from construction costs saved up? And if they don't have any, that may be an issue. Okay. Let's see, what else? Let's talk a minute about how do you find right now your commercial opportunities? I think a lot of people right now are probably looking on the I guess you guys call it Bright now, Bright MLS, right? In the commercial world, we don't really search Bright for commercial properties. So if you were only putting your properties on Bright, then people probably are not seeing your listings. And if you are searching for properties, you're probably only looking at a fraction of what is available. Most of the properties that get done in commercial real estate, though, are not on the market at all. And it's done through who you know and what you know. That's kind of how commercial world gets done. There's a big difference between your Bright MLS and in the commercial world, what we call commercial information exchanges. A commercial information exchange is just giving you information about the assets, but there is no, and this is from a court standpoint, reasonable expectation of compensation. Okay, so don't expect to get paid just because you saw the property advertised in a commercial information exchange. We'll go a little bit over that next month as well when we talk about leasing and commissions and how to get paid. But just know there's not a reasonable, in the court of law, there's no reasonable expectation for compensation just because the property is advertised. Okay. Now there's ways that you can still get paid, but just know that's probably the biggest difference between a commercial information exchange and a multiple listing services. Also, in an MLS, excuse me, I think there's a monthly fee or something that Bright charges, which is pretty nominal. In commercial, it is not uncommon to have to pay minimal $100 a month for just access to see the commercial properties, all the way up to $600-700 a month if you want full analytical capabilities. Okay, so just know that the availability for the properties is not cheap at all. So it doesn't really, I mean, you got to make your own business decisions, but it doesn't really make sense necessarily to jump in and sign up for yearly contracts if you're not going to have an opportunity to produce at least enough income to pay for those services that are going to be required. So just kind of, you know, put that feather in your hat. It's not free. There is a free version, but you only get a small percentage. Basically, if you want the information, you got to pay for it, and they are, you know, very expensive.
Got a couple questions on some of those websites and platforms.
Sure.
If somebody has a commercial property that they want to list on Loopnet, how do they go about accessing it? And then, like, second part of the question is, where else can they advertise?
Yeah, great question. And we are generating, as we go along, a resources tab, if you will, or platform for home sale. Real quick, though, if you go to bhhscre.com, that is Berkshire Hathaway Home Services commercial kind of website, and all the commercial agents across the country can put their commercial listings in there, and that's free to anybody who wants to search for commercial property. So first and foremost, that resource is available right now to everyone. BHHS CRE, like commercial real estate.com. Okay, we have some of our agents are on there. I'm not sure yet. There you go. Thank you, Jen Jones. Appreciate that. So that service is available right now. There is we do have someone at home sale that will upload the listings into Loopnet for you on our silver platform, but there are some criterias that we are trying to work through so that we can make sure that those will achieve the highest rate of success possible. All right. I can say to everyone on this call is that it's free to advertise on Loopnet. So you can go right now, Loopnet, LLOPNET.com. You can go right now and upload a listing in there if you want to, but you won't be able to see it, right? If you want to see it, like if you want to see who's looking at it, if you want to see how many clicks and views and everything that you achieve on that listing, that's going to cost you at least $100 a month. So that's why, you know, kind of got to be careful with that. Also, Loopnet is owned by CoStar, which is kind of like the game stopper for all commercial information, because they own everything, and that is the firm that charges the $600-700 a month, depending on your licensing and your subscription. So they do have a lot of market share, but you know, again, not cheap. Probably wouldn't recommend for somebody just starting out in commercial because the expenses. Which kind of brings me to my next question, or my next statement on the timeline for a commercial deal. So commercial real estate takes very long to close, whether it's a lease or a sale. And you may be working on a deal. Like I said, my first deal, I worked for a couple of years on the deal and never closed, right? So if the average cycle is 18 months and you're paying, you know, $600-700 a month out in marketing expenses before you even have an opportunity to receive a paycheck, you kind of got to know that going into it. So I would always encourage anyone that's looking to get into commercial real estate to first seek a mentor, seek someone that has access and some of the tools and resources that you need in order to get to the next step, right? So just know that that is it's an expensive endeavor, and the timeline is going to be much longer than your residential practicing business. So I always tell residential agents when they ask me, should they get into commercial? I say, well, how many houses can you sell in a year? And if their answer is, you sell 10, right? And you make, you know, $50,000, or you can sell one commercial deal and make $50,000. Like, we're making the same amount of money, right? It's just you prefer to do 10 deals and smaller, or do you prefer to get one paycheck a year and have it big, right? So that's the other thing about commercial that I just want to kind of caution everyone. It takes a long time. Okay, Jen, do you have a question?
Yeah, a couple questions. You know, you talked a little bit about Loopnet. What other websites out there do you recommend them looking into? Any comments, insight on Marcus and Millichamp and their ability to do outside listings, or talk to us about what that looks like and what your recommendations are there?
Yeah, so Marcus and Millichamp is actually a broker, a national broker, and the information on their site is probably geared towards their listings. It's not uncommon in the commercial brokerage. So if you go to any of the major commercial brokerage houses and you search for listings, you're probably only going to get those listings that come up on their sites for their agents that are listing those properties, right? Not uncommon at all. Happens all the time in our sphere. As for other sites, I mean, Crexy is one. The biggest thing I could say is you would probably want to just really work your own, like y'all have heard in the residential business, work your sphere of influence, right? Work your networks, work your local chamber of commerce. Hang out with business owners. That's probably going to be the fastest way, or a little bit more of the complicated ways. Go and volunteer at a commercial real estate trade association and just hang out. There's trade associations for everything, for commercial building materials, for commercial education, for industrial and office properties, and go and say, hey, I want to learn commercial, and is there anything that I can do to help the trade association, even if that means, sending out the mailers, sending out the emails, making the phone calls, but you get in the room, right? That's what's important. So as for actual websites, CoStar, Loopnet, Prexy, Bright, Google. It's not one specific source like you have right now in the MLS. Okay, good question though.
Switching gears a little bit, can a commercial listing agreement be longer than 1 year at the initial signing?
Yes. And also not uncommon to have it longer than 1 year.
Do you know off the top of your head which website is the $600 to $700 a month platform that gives you access to commercial listings and data?
That'd be CoStar.
I'm just scrolling back through.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good.
Some questions about the study period that you touched on and it impacting the timeline. How long is the standard study period?
Well, it depends on who you represent, right? If you represent the buyer or the tenant, you want a very long study period. If you're representing the landlord or the seller, you want a very short study period, because essentially you've taken that asset off the market while that other party is studying it. So if you are representing, the seller, you want that study period to be really short, 30 days or less. If you're representing the buyer, you want that study period to be 90, 120 days. So not uncommon for at least 3 months for a study period.
Does it make a difference if if for a developed property being used for the same purpose as the previous business? Does that affect it, weigh into that time period at all?
That could shorten it, I would say, simply because the zoning would probably not need to get changed. Business brokerage is not necessarily an avenue that we should be going down, though. But if you were buying an asset that used to house a dry cleaners and you have a dry cleaners tenant, I would say it would be a reasonable assumption, but trust but verify. It would be able to be used as a dry cleaners again. So maybe, but I would still say, it's specific to each situation. Okay.
How do you determine the class of a property? Is that part of the study?
It is part of the study, and it's also part of the commercial information exchange. So they'll usually have asset classifications, and you kind of just know as you're going into it. If you're looking at retail, a shopping center with a Wegmans, I don't know if y'all have Wegmans, but Whole Foods or something, right? Is going to command a higher rental rate than a shopping center with Food Line. It's just, it is what it is. So you kind of, as you get into it, you just kind of know those things.
Any type of or variation of the seller's disclosure that's getting used?
Great question. Seller's disclosures. Yeah, we don't do that. Duty of discovery is on the buyer or the tenant. You can ask for a seller disclosure, and they're going to say, yeah, have your contractor and engineer tell you what's wrong with the building. So we don't really, have a standard form like, does the roof leak? You know what I mean? It's just one of the differences between residential and commercial, which is kind of like the last thing that I wanted to talk about was the difference between residential and commercial, and like business etiquette versus like, your residential day to day. So in commercial, most everything is done by appointments, and it's usually done 3 or 4 days. Like there's never an emergency in commercial real estate unless if it's a failure on someone's part. Like if somebody says, I need to go look at this property tomorrow because my lease is up in 2 weeks, you can't find them a place, negotiate a deal, get the property right in 2 weeks. You're chasing your own tail, right? They should have called you 4 or 5 months ago. So the emergencies are really not emergencies in our eyes because they should have already been dealt with previously. We also don't typically show properties on nights or weekends. It's all done by appointment and done in business hours. So, you may not be able to schedule a lot of showings if those are the hours that you're trying to show properties in. It's just, think of it, as a more like professional 9 to 5 kind of operation, because a lot of those commercial practitioners are employees of bigger, larger commercial firms, and they don't answer their phone after 5 o'clock. So kind of just changes the mindset a little bit for you when you're doing commercial brokerage activity. Just know that okay, if my client wants to see properties on a Saturday, that may limit the availability of properties that the owner or the other brokers are willing to go out and meet them and open up the properties to. We don't have center cards like you guys have, or whatever you guys call that, right? The electronic card thing. Like we don't use those. We still use the spin type lock boxes, or it's done by appointment. So yeah. All right, any other questions here? Let me see.
A couple other questions. Lots of questions about Loopnet. So guys, I put our home sale Loopnet contacts in the chat box for you. Allison in Agent Services is the one who has the qualifications and information on which properties they are putting into Loopnet, and is the contact for that. So feel free to grab her email out of the chat box so you guys have it. 2 more questions before we kind of wrap up for the day. What does the term multi-use property mean? Does that mean if something is zoned for multi-use?
What does the term multi-use property? It usually means there's a retail storefront with an apartment above. Generally speaking, in a lot of these smaller drive-through communities that y'all have in Pennsylvania, and even in parts of Maryland and West Virginia, and we have small drive-through opportunities, and those represent themselves as commercial storefronts with an apartment upstairs. So that would be a multi-use zone property, meaning you can use the property for a commercial use as well as a residential use. Okay, good question now.
I would say for this last question coming in, we kind of do a general answer, and this could be a really good topic to dive into deeper details on for a future session. Do you use the same forms to represent a buyer, and what forms do you use for an offer? How does that compare with residential? So that kind of makes sense of why I see it that way.
Okay, so just a little bit of backstory. So we already kind of did a test run with this platform with all the managers and stuff, and we said, hey, what are some topics that you think we're going to want to have covered in the commercial corner for the 2020? And that is actually one of the topics that we're going to cover. I'm not sure which month, but some month this year, we're going to cover specifically documents, what we use, how to use them, key terms and documents, all the things along those lines. The short answer is, we don't write our own contracts. Our contracts are written generally by attorneys. So yeah, we don't have the same boilerplate contracts because every situation is different. Like I could show you 36 different leases and all the formats of the leases are going to be different. So that's a good leeway into, we're going to get to that at some point this year. It's going to be a whole hour just on that.
Yep. So our goal today, guys, was, with this being the first one, we really wanted to give you a good, solid introduction. And then because it is the first one, make sure that any initial needs, questions that you guys had, we got you a quick, direct answer on. So I stuck my email in the chat box too. Please let us know what suggestions you have for future topics, what things we touched on today that you want to go over in more details, and Scott and I will get together and we will kind of go into the different topics that we're going to cover for the full hour session. So today was a great start and a good overview, and there's much more to come.
Thank you, Jen.
Anything else you want to add?
No, just thank you all for being here. It was a pleasure. And excited about this year and what's happening with our company and how we can all help each other grow and do more business. So I think that's a great thing. And I'm glad to see that there is such interest in this topic. So hopefully you'll be back next month. And like I said, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, reach out to Jen and I and your manager, right? And kind of, let's form a game plan.
Yep. So be on the lookout.
Quick comment, Jen. Stephanie Graybill just asked a great question about commercial licenses versus residential license. That's a Maryland distinction. Pennsylvania, there's only one type of license. You're either a licensed agent or a broker. There's not a commercial or residential licensing. In Maryland, there is, and Stephanie will reach out to you and get you a direct response to that, exactly what the differences are.
Thanks, Rod. And
Yep.
Be on the lookout. I'm going to send a follow-up email out so you guys have the direct link for the recording and have a link to all of that vocab and a good breakdown cheat sheet so that you have that as a resource too. So thank you guys. I appreciate you tuning in, and thanks, Scott, for sharing your expertise.
Certainly. Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.